This video is about intake version 2. Yes, we've made an update, fixed a couple of things, and I'm going to walk you through what's new and a couple of tips about how to do it well. All right, if we're going to think intake and the intake workflow that we've created, it's really worth reminding ourselves of the 5 steps. So step 1 is where we put in basic details of the proposed client, possible notes, those kinds of things. Step 2 is then when we look at additional parties, whether they're related parties or other parties. We can do the conflict checks, etc. Step 3 is the really big kind of operator screen where we deal with the conflict check of our proposed client. And we also make some choices about new client, existing client, and what we're going to do with additional details, which I'll show you in a second. Step 4 and step 5 are essentially check and save the client, check and save the service. Now, if you're doing an actual new client, step 4 and step 5 will come up in sequence. It'll be a simple order. Once you've said, right, I don't have a conflict, no problem, it's going to be a new client because they're not in the system, then it'll take you to the client page at step 4 and walk you through. And then once you've saved that, you'll finish with saving the service. An interesting thing happens though, if it's an existing client, essentially we skip step 4 and we land on the start of step 5. We can go in and deal with the service, or if we want, we can actually look at the client as well. It doesn't matter which order you do it when it's an existing client, as long as you do both and save it, because if you don't, the intake won't go away. Now here's the thing, you can only have one intake process open at one time. Some people have asked for that to be changed, but we now know that when we've played with it, it's actually a little confusing as to which intake it is, especially if they're not a client yet. You're kind of in a process. So for now, we're going to leave it. Only one intake procedure can be open at a time. So if it's still sitting there on a tab, you're going to have to save the client, save the service to get out of there, or just give up and close it. So let's see what this looks like in real life. So to do intakes, of course, we go to class and then we head to new intake. So I'm just going to whip up a dummy service for us. So essentially I've got a name, Debbie Smith, deliberately spelt, a bit strangely, and a diminutive of obviously Deborah or something like that. And we've got, in theory here, a brand new address. Let's just say Debbie's walked in and said, I've just moved. So that address is not going to be on the system. That's important to note. Let's have a look. We step through to additional parties. But in this example, we're just going to skip this step. Here's where we would normally add another party, say an other party or a related party. Let's skip it, go straight through to intake step 3, which you can always do. Okay, so it's dragged the details across our name and address. Now remember I said it was a new address, so we definitely don't want to search for it because it's not going to be on the system to anyone called Debbie Smith. Going to delete that and the address. This is just for the search. It's not actually deleting it in the record when it comes to the other end. In this case, it could be Deb, Debbie, Deborah, so we don't know, so I'm just going to reduce it back. You could also just delete that one and maybe sort for different things later. For now, we'll go with Deb Smith and search. Now we found actually who I was looking for. It's actually Deborah Johnson. Let's say it was her former name, pre-marriage name. And we can see that over here that it's because her additional name is Deb Smith, it's actually come up perfectly. We know this is the right person in this case. Generally, you might have to look a little bit harder, actually look at the client carefully, make sure it's the right person, especially when it's not the same name. But for our example, we'll tick it and we're going to go to one of the choices, existing client. Like I said, if she wasn't on the system and there was no conflict, we could create a new client from scratch, go to step 4, then step 5. This is where it becomes different. We're going to do existing client. Here we go. Now, when it's an existing client, we get a new pop-up. And essentially this says, do you wish to make the details you have entered? And the example that I made was for a new address and a new slightly alternate spelling of the name. So if you click yes, it'll move those additional details as the primary name and a primary address. And if you click no, it'll just save that stuff as additional details. Now, if you don't know what a primary address or name, etc. is, it's the stuff that shows on the front page of the client. The idea is it's the most up-to-date information, but sometimes you have former things or alternate addresses, as we'll see. So the safety is always just save as an additional detail, because maybe I want to put, I don't know, the address as a primary, but then keep the name as a secondary or additional detail. We can decide later if we just save it as additional detail. So that's what I'm going to do. and that'll move us through the process. Now this might take a few seconds because it's actually saving a couple of steps, saving the client, the additional details in the client, and now it's flicking over to the service as well, and it's just saving the basic details into that. But now we've landed on the client page, and actually a slightly renamed client services tab. This is listing all their previous services. With the green one, it's marked in a color deliberately just to show you that that's the one that you just created. So this is the one we need to deal with. Now remember, at the start I said you both need to save the client or the service in either order, but both have to be done. So for argument's sake, in this case, I'll do it in reverse order just so we can see what that's like. To do it, we'll click here on the service ID to actually open the service, and there's a couple of things we're going to need to save. You should be familiar with these now. It's stuff like the financial disadvantage indicator. These three, they're compulsory for everyone from the new data standards. Obviously I'd answer these correctly. Now, if we're not sure which ones are compulsory, and ideally they do have the little red exclamation marks, but if they're not there, you can just save it and it'll tell you what's going on. I can close that now, and down the bottom here it's told us that motor service delivery is also compulsory. Of course we'll get that fixed as quickly as we can, so you'll see those ones before you actually have to save it to see where they are. So it's a little glitch that we're working on. Okay, so here's that's all finished, and I can just save. In fact, I'm going to save and close. That brings us back a tab, back to intake step 4. That is the client one because we haven't actually finished that. That's why the intake remains open. So now we've got two things we can have a look at. We've got the client, and there's the information there, but we've also got the additional details. Now it's all pulled the extra things in, which is fine. There's the new address I made, and there's the name, but we've got a little issue here. We want to change, say, around what's primary, but the tip I want to give you and underscore its importance is save the client first. And again, it may tell you that you've got some things that we need to deal with, and that's saved perfectly. So now it's saved, we can safely play with additional details. So I'm going to change, say, this residential address to primary over here, and we'll click on that and mark it as primary and save and close. And that should just immediately flick that across. And also I'm going to maybe change one of these to Deborah Smith. So I might edit that and change this to primary. So we have Deborah and primary. Save and close. So we can see a bunch of variations. Debbie, etc. We could add Deb Smith as another one as well. So that's all fine. It's all saved. We saved the client before, we've saved the intake. So it's actually safe to close this, because the reason that's important is we should probably go and reopen it. That will make it refresh it because we've changed some of the addresses and name information. So I'm just going to do a little search for her again. And there she is. Her name is actually changed, and well, let's click on it and double check that it's all good. We've got Deborah Smith, and we have the Fitzroy address, so it's worked perfectly. The reason I said do that in that order, save the client first, then muck around with additional details, is you risk overwriting the old address because it hasn't automatically updated if you go and save it again after changing additional details. If you went and save it in the client page, it'd actually bring it back to where you were. You don't want to do that. So in summary, you can do the services first, like there, which was that one we did, then save the client, fiddle with additional details, but then don't go back to client yet. If you've changed additional details, make sure you close it and then reopen it, and then it'll refresh correctly. That's all I've got. Chris Bro signing off.